Yes.
So, good afternoon from Wageningen. My name's Ken Giller. I'm afraid this afternoon we've been hoping very much that I'd be having a conversation with Rebecca Nelson, who's also teaching on the MOOC this week, but we've run into all sorts of technical issues, feedback loops that you might have heard earlier, and Rebecca started off at home. Now she's gone to the office, but unfortunately, you know, Cornell University obviously doesn't have the technology yet to join in on these things. The aim of the discussion this afternoon that we wanted to have was really to consider this whole idea of technology and ecology. Where did technology and ecology come together? And we had a number of different topics that we were thinking of covering. I'm just trying to think what maybe the best way of covering these is. First of all, and you know, who knows, maybe Rebecca will join in later on. First of all, I'd like to think a bit about the whole framing of agriculture. So we'll think about the whole idea of sustainable intensification. We've, during the course, Achim Doberman, particularly in the first week, was really emphasizing the need to increase the total amount of food being produced in the world, and we need to do that obviously in a sustainable way. But then we have lots of different approaches to agriculture about how we might do that. So very often things are framed in sustainable intensification, then sometimes in what people call agroecological intensification or ecological intensification, and there are many, many different ideas around this. And we get to the point that some people say that the whole sustainable intensification debate is really something which is greenwashing from the big industry. So if you look on the internet, you'll find from some of the bigger companies, the big agrochemical companies have websites around sustainable intensification. And in a sense, they say that the whole idea has been hijacked there. So on the other side, we've got arguments around agroecological intensification and agroecology. So if we go onto the FAO websites, for instance, there's now portals for agroecology, which are in a sense a bit on one could argue, you know, is that the other side? We tend to get into this idea of dichotomies, really. So on the agroecology website of FAO, I was looking through this morning, and they've got lots of different examples of agroecological approaches. But in many ways, for me, that goes a bit almost, you know, to the far other side, because that seems to be, by the FAO now, being equated with organic agriculture. And I think then, yeah, organic agriculture, is that the only form of agroecology? Is that the only way ecology can really be used in agriculture? Now, this afternoon, we'd really like to encourage you to raise your own questions. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and then we can maybe actually pick up on those. And I'm just getting a message from Rebecca to say that she's now online. Is that right, Rebecca? And can she hear us, I wonder? So now Rebecca can finally hear us and we can't hear her. So we'll just carry on.
Someone's got me. Oh, can you hear me now? Woo! Awesome.
So Rebecca, you're with us. Rebecca, I've just been waffling around talking about sustainable intensification. So let's hear from you then, first of all. What's the difference for you between agroecological intensification and sustainable intensification?
I suppose the agroecological one is just a more specific commitment to a particular means. Sustainable intensification is good, but it doesn't commit to any particular avenue, whereas agroecological would say that you're improving the performance of agriculture by utilizing agroecological principles. So I think the faults that people have commented on with regard to sustainable intensification have to do with its being rather vague about what it means by sustainable and how it will be achieved, which isn't necessarily a huge problem, but I like the idea of committing to using agroecological principles as effectively as possible. So for instance, it seems like a large, a lot of the conversation around sustainable intensification has to do with improving efficiency of input use, for example.
Sure.
And, whereas when you think of agroecological intensification, that would be a step, but it's sort of regarded as a first step, improving efficiency, and then you're trying to substitute, for example, agroecological options for what are currently perhaps roles being fulfilled by industrial or manufactured inputs. So Gleesman, for example, sees a series of steps for agroecological intensification that start with efficiency and then go to substitution. So in the first step, you'd be reducing fertilizer use through putting it in the right place at the right time, the right formulation, and so on. And then you'd be bringing in legumes, for example, to provide some of the nutrients that you might have been applying from purchase. And then after you started to substitute, you start to transform the system through diversification, crop livestock integration, the implementing trees and agroforestry schemes, from plot to landscape and so on, trying to transform the system to be more agroecologically sound. And then Gleesman goes on to add all sorts of more human systems things, from linking producers and consumers, and then transforming the world food system. So I think that's the sort of thinking you'll get from people who are using agroecological or ecological intensification, whereas sustainable intensification, maybe less so. Maybe it's more vague and more mainstream.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about your views on this, Ken.
Well, you pointed me yesterday to the FAO website on agroecology. And I was digging around in that. And one of the things I thought it's useful. It's nice. They've got these 10 concepts now around agroecology. Although it looks like the website's not quite ready yet. It seems that they've got maybe some more work to do. But one of the things that really struck me in that is that when I started looking through the specific examples, it sounds all very good at a very global level. But I'm a bit of a realist. I want to see how this works in practice. And when I started digging around some of the fact sheets on the different projects that they were proposing, those were all really about organic approaches, purely organic approaches. And then, I actually was using this wonderful tool, which is a global search facility for the word fertilizer, and it didn't show up anywhere. And I guess what I struggle with very much in my work is that we tend to go very much into it's this or that, the dichotomies. I mean, we've seen this. So it's organic or it's conventional. And people talk about things being better than conventional agriculture. And then I'm saying to myself, but then, what's conventional agriculture? We look across the world. 99% of the agriculture is not organic. Does that mean that's all conventional when we've got all of that array of different types and approaches to agriculture, ranging from very, very large farms down to tiny, tiny farms, and that's all conventional agriculture? We tend to want to put things in pigeonholes always, and that's where I struggle with some of these concepts and definitions.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think that's just that's a taxonomy that would basically serve the organic sector, because it distinguishes them from it's us or everybody else. So that obviously that's a dichotomy that is relevant if you're trying to sell organic produce for a markup. But I obviously there are much more useful taxonomies that reflect the rich spectra of context that agriculture is performed in. And so I think for people like ourselves who are not, specifically pursuing organic as an aim, but rather trying to look at the whole of agriculture and see how we can improve its performance, I think that we need more useful typologies than that. And I know that you have done a lot of work on farm typologies. Perhaps you could comment on how you construct your typologies and why, and I think, we've discussed the utility of different options for different contexts. And I would totally agree with the organic people and using a organic conventional for their purposes, so not to fault them, but rather to say for people looking at other contexts, what sorts of typologies could be more useful? How has your typology work been justified or organized?
So maybe just to get over one of my other hobby horses, if you like, is that very often I think that we're often putting up an alternative, and we create almost, when we put up an alternative, we want to say this alternative is better. We often portray it as being better than something else, and we're often choosing something which is like one of the worst examples to compare it with, if you understand. I mean, we create a straw man in order to be able to show that what we're doing is better than what's been done before. And I think that we've got to move beyond this somehow. So in terms of typologies and that whole idea, and we worked a lot on this, particularly in relation to looking at smallholder farming, because people were tending to talk about the smallholder farmers, say, in Africa. And then you've got to recognize, of course, that you've got this Africa, a hugely diverse continent with all sorts of different types of agriculture in terms of the agroecological zonation, so using agroecological in terms of its environmental, soils, climate aspects. And then going right down to, in every single village, you'd find farmers with a huge difference in relation to the resources they have available, the land and labor and the investment capacity that they have for agriculture. And we really felt that it was necessary to try and explode this so that we stopped talking about the smallholder farmer. And we recognize this huge diversity among farmers. And then trying to understand from that, what can we do to use different types of principles to actually assist different farmers to make the choices that they need to make when they're looking to improve or intensify their agriculture. And so it's really an idea of then trying to think about what types of technology on the one hand fit to what types of smallholder farmer on the other hand, and recognizing that diversity. I think that's been extremely useful exercise. It's helped us to think much more deeply about the constraints that farmers face. And one of the analogies I like to use is when we're thinking about this whole idea of technology, we need to maybe keep back to the topic of the day, technology and ecology. It's an idea of, if the technology is the square peg, we need to find a square hole that would fit in terms of the context, and that hole has to be the right size for that square peg. And we shouldn't be trying to force the round peg into the square hole. It's that sort of idea. So that for technology to work, it has to fit the context. And for me, that's really the way I like to use ecology in agriculture. It's really thinking about ecology. For me is we go back to its roots. Is about, we call it ecos. It's the home. It's looking for the home, if you like, of the organism. It's understanding organisms in relation to their niche, to their environment. And I like to think about agriculture very much in those terms. So using ecological principles in a conceptual way.
Yeah, so can I take you up on that? You've used a couple of concepts here that I think, I'm not sure if during the long prelude while I was struggling with my technology, technology and I are not on the greatest of terms at this particular moment, but now we're reconciling. But you use the notion of principles and the notion of technology and the notion of ecology. And for me, I'm curious if you've addressed the nature of those different ideas in the previous minutes of this call. Because for me, ecology and technology are not so clearly distinguished. I have heard, crop varieties being referred to as technologies. The push-pull technology is an ecological one. So for me, I don't see them as an effective dichotomy. I can't even dichotomize them. Honestly, many things I could for some operational purpose, but for me, I can't separate them into a meaningful dichotomy. So for me, a technology is something that's reasonably well specified that can be put to work, and it could be, a machine, it could be a plant, it could be a principle, perhaps. Well, but I think principle is a little bit different though. So I was wondering if you had dealt with that issue. So I think for both of us, the principle is an understanding that then can again be localized, that it can be put to work in a different way for different purposes and different people. So that's one issue I wanted to get out. The other one is that you're in talking about typologies, you came down to the level of farms. And I think that your work though has also illustrated that even within a farm, the different fields within a farm can be quite different and constitute very different contexts, such that the way that a farmer would use a certain principle would be quite different among her or his different fields. And even just the point that a household isn't one unit, you can have people with very different contexts within a household and within a farm. So anyway, those 2 points, one about context, one about technology versus ecology versus principles.
No, very much. I mean, we've been thinking in our own work, and I come, if you like, from a discipline of agronomy, if you like, that we need to look there at a whole multi-level approach, where we look, if you like, from the level of the field, the farm component, if you like, up to the farm, the way the farm fits in with a farming system. I like to define a farming system as the level at which you've got multiple farms, maybe diverse farms interacting. And then from there, if you like, up to the regional, provincial level and higher. And of course, with the agroecological context in terms of climate and soils often being the overall determining factors about which types of production systems are possible in a given environment. Maybe if we come back, obviously we can, the word technology, of course, as you rightly point out, has quite a range of different interpretations. But one thing, when I was preparing for this debate, which has really stuck in my mind, was a discussion that we had at the first International Conference on Global Food Security, when it came up very clearly that if the use of technology, and now here we may be thinking more about the use of maybe chemical approaches or biotech approaches, so GM approaches, that type of what people would see as more high-tech technology, that to see that involved in the production of food was something that people often didn't want. Yeah? Whereas if it's a matter of thinking about technology in your pocket, so I mean, if everybody wants the latest smartphone or whatever, or the latest computer, so we're all looking for technology in our lives, a smart car or whatever. Technology in those ways seems to be very, very easily accepted, but technology in food production seems to be something that people often really shy away from. They shun. And
agriculture is always technology, whether you're talking about anything that you do in farming is arguably a technology. It could be traditional technology or agroecological technology, but so the distinctions, I think, maybe I'm ill-equipped as a scientist to have this debate in a way that's meaningful to people who hold different opinions. But for me, I again find it difficult to make those distinctions. And it seems like if the distinction isn't just whether it's outside my body or inside my body, because people seem happy to use very high-tech drugs. A friend of mine who's an ecologist, finally his doctor drew the line on his fungal foot infection and said, you've got to deal with this. So he's taking systemic fungicides for his, toe fungus infection. Whereas I think he would be quite opposed to a farmer using fungicides on his or her, crop. So, I've never seen a massive objection to, a better insulin product that's genetically engineered. I've never, maybe I'm in ignorance of that, but I don't think people prefer to have their insulin extracted from cow glands anymore. But they don't like that in farming. I don't know. I'm not the right one to comment, I guess.
So let's take some examples. I think it'd be good if we can try and ground this. We're getting a bit, we're maybe with some specific examples. So for yourself, you've worked quite a lot in relation to crop breeding, selective breeding, and biological control, different ways of addressing pests and diseases, I understand. So how do you see those techniques as being effective on? And use, in relation to, say, otherwise using chemical control.
So how effective are agroecological principles?
Well, where do you see the division between?
I mean, I suppose, practically speaking, I would see the difference around. I mean, there are many agroecological principles that you can use in pest management. Diversification is an extremely powerful way of reducing pest pressure. You simply don't necessarily have to face enormous pest pressure if you're using a diversified system, although there are exceptions to that, certainly. So I guess you could see the use of biopesticides as, I clearly see a purchased, highly toxic agrochemical as being not an agroecological technique. That would be in fact, the global standard is using purchased toxic chemicals to manage pests. And much as those have obvious and well-known downsides, that is the global norm for pest management. So that's perhaps the non-ecological side. But when you're using biopesticides, you can extract all sorts of toxic compounds from plants and apply them. So if you're gathering local Tephrosia, some local weed from your environment, and you're brewing up a potion at home and applying it to your crops, you can also manage pests that way. You can apply herbage of different sorts in field or in the store and control pests. Now, is that agroecological, or is that chemical control? That's again, I think a lot of these things are in the eyes of the beholder. You cited the FAO website, which is very young, should be understood to be in its infancy. I mean, it's generally the people, I think, who are contributing to it do take a fairly strong, committed view towards agroecology that's more purist than my own. I fancy myself a centrist, so does everyone, I suppose. But yeah, everyone's at the center of their universe. Well, I'm at the center of mine, and I feel like we should bring in the best of the idea set from the recent modern agriculture era, with the best ideas from traditional agriculture, from theory, from hardcore experimental biology to manage our problems. But I think when it comes to managing pests by spraying organisms that kill natural enemies, have substantial toxicity for the user of that pesticide and the consumer of whoever's eating the product with their residues. I mean, I think that for me is something that we could do better than that.
But okay, a couple of things. I mean, one of the questions that's come onto the chat is it's basically very much about this. How can we address sustainable intensification and at the same time, make sure that we're not damaging in relation to SDG 3 in terms of health, through using pesticides. So this is very topical to the discussion we're having. But I mean, I understand as well. I mean, you were talking about biological pesticides, ones you can extract from plants. But very often they can have quite high mammalian toxicity, as well as having a broad range as being toxic to natural enemies as well. So
well, I think empirically,
they don't escape from that, do they?
Yeah, I mean, you could set it up as being an ambiguous, line that you could debate. But I think the empirical evidence that I'm aware of says that the plant extracts that are used as biopesticides that I'm aware of are actually do not have the same natural enemy toxicity that these synthetic compounds have for whatever reason, which doesn't mean that synthetics couldn't be improved. In fact, that same compound, whatever it is, or blend of compounds that are working well from your Tephrosia or your other, whatever your biological sources, can be synthesized in principle and produced then as a manufactured product. So again, you could, where you draw the line, it's like vegetarianism or any other ethical issue. At some point, it becomes a personal matter of personal ethic, and I don't think we can resolve it as a global community, but I think we can at least point to some of these issues. In fact, I would cite many of those same sorts of ambiguities around general genetic engineering. It was put forward as something that prevented, in the public eye, as something that prevents people from saving their own seed, whereas in potato, if you use transgenic virus resistance, farmers can then save their seeds. The whole reason they buy Dutch seed potatoes is because they're viral degeneracy, which can be prevented by genetic engineering in a straightforward manner. So I think when people dig into these cases of technology versus ecology, they're going to confront a lot of these gray areas.
So maybe we could just dwell on that just for a minute, because I think the whole idea, particularly of genetic engineering, genetically engineered crops, or what we call GMOs in Europe, is for many people is also an anathema in terms of their food supply. Many, GM-free labeling is coming up more and more, and a big push against it. But listening to you, I mean, in terms of, and I know you come at this also from a breeding angle, that you wouldn't necessarily rule out genetic engineering approaches in terms of pest and disease control, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, would I personally?
Yeah.
No, I'm open-minded about. For me, genetic engineering is a plant breeding technique. I don't see it in greatly different terms than other genetic engineering techniques. So, I mean, sorry, other plant breeding techniques. I think maybe what people get, maybe one factor behind the hostility to genetic engineering is that it tends to be monopolized by the big private sector. But I would argue that so does conventional breeding tend to get monopolized by the big private sector. So I mean, for me, the frontier is more what's being done by whom, for whom. And, if, for example, the public sector or any other sector could provide disease-resistant NSAID or banana, these important crops for many people in East Africa that were resistant to Xanthomonas wilt, I would see that as a good thing. But you'd have to make sure that there's no sort of ecological downside disaster involved.
I mean, I was involved in this report from the National Academy of Sciences in the US, and I think one thing that came through to me very clearly in that debate was how we need to really look at that issue more a trait-by-trait basis, because obviously there are traits which we can genetically engineer, which can lock you into using more agrochemicals. The Roundup Ready would be one, and you've got traits which could actually lock you into being able to use much less agrochemicals, such as in, a good examples, the Phytophthora resistance in potato, for instance.
Absolutely, yeah. Once you've seen a 3-day spray schedule on potato, you have to, your mind gets open to the idea of alternatives, whatever they may be. On the other hand, Ken, I could make arguments in favor of genetic engineering as long as they're ecologically positive, don't have horrible negatives, and don't lock in anything horrific on the who or what sides, toxicities or monopolies or anything else. On the other hand, I think that the tendency, at least in my country, of agricultural discussions to zero in on genetic engineering, ignoring everything else, it also seems pathological to me. I feel like that's far from the only issue, and if you took that issue off the table, you'd still have so much to discuss, so many monstrous issues to confront, so many degrees of freedom in terms of how you confront them, that I feel like the whole conversation around genetic engineering is weirdly, taken over the agenda beyond its rights, in my view. So I've become somewhat hostile to it just because I'm bored by it and don't see the merits of the conversation on either side. And I feel like there's so much more you can do with or without genetic engineering. It just seems like not a non-issue, but not a very high priority issue for me. I mean, it's something that I could practice as a breeding-oriented plant geneticist, and I generally have not. For me, it's always been, for the last several decades, a hypothesis testing instrument principally. But for actual practice, there's generally plenty of ways to control any given pest or disease that I've ever dealt with. Yeah, I worked on Phytophthora in potato for years. There's lots of natural disease resistance in potato. You don't have to go to genetic engineering. It's a lot easier to breed potatoes using genetic engineering because it's a tetraploid. So genetic engineering is extremely technically attractive because conventional breeding of potatoes is so difficult. Yet it can be done. It is done.
So let's not get hung up on the GE debate.
Okay.
So there's a question here, and I'm going to pose it to you because it's on the chat, and it's actually from the question.
Renska.
Yeah. So actually, from two guys in my group here. That's why I'm going to pose it to you. It's a
okay.
question. So it basically says, given the economic and political barriers to increase food production, so how can we actually move forward technological, ecological advances in practice? Wow, that's a difficult.
Let's share that one, Ken. there's a lot going on in agriculture. I think they are moving forward. Lotte and Renske, do you want to cite any particular context or any particular technology? Because I think Ken and I have established that speaking in generalities is difficult, because the questions, and the most meaningful questions and potential answers are interestingly particular to different contexts. So are you thinking of any particular context there?
I'm not sure if we'll be able to get the response onto the thread directly, but
maybe we could pick. Should 10-second delay? Okay. So do we want to abuse our 10-second delay by choosing our own context of choice, Ken?
Well, I mean, economic and political barriers to increase food production. I mean, I think context matters, of course. I think the economic barriers for many farmers are often the price received at farm gate by the farm. One of my bugbears on this whole issue really is that the amount of money that we pay for food is often very, very small, and a very, very small fraction of that gets back to the producer. And I think that we've got to really do something structural in our food supply to make sure that food production becomes more economical for the producer, and actually allows then the producer to actually reap more benefit there, which will allow them then potentially to invest in much more environmentally friendly approaches to production. That's the one side. And I mean, the other side, if I think about economic and political barriers, then of course a lot of my own work, like yours as well, is in Africa, and there we're dealing with huge constraints in relation to infrastructure and the capacity to invest of farmers, which obviously prevent them from accessing technology. So, and those are two, if you like, areas that I think of.
So I agree that economic barriers are real, and so I think we have to think of the economic costs and benefits of agroecological and other technologies. It has recently come home to me thinking of upstate New York dairy farming as a context in particular. So you could use the methane produced from a dairy farm to warm greenhouses and generate energy for the farm and intensify production on the farm, expanding the cropping season if you're running a crop livestock operation. But you can only invest in that methane generation capability if you have a certain profitability. You simply don't have the resources to do it if you're running a small marginal operation. So in that sense, I would agree. But on the other hand, I also, in my country, I feel like there are a lot of companies that could afford to be more sustainable, implement more sustainable approaches and don't elect to do so. So I'm not totally convinced that not having money is a binding constraint that prevents innovation and investment. And let's face it, some ecological methods require innovation and investment. But having money doesn't guarantee that you will implement.
But I do think there's clearly an economy of scale in this, yeah. And in some of the work we've been doing, I mean, we tend to see this. Well, certainly in more developed countries, certainly even in the Netherlands, where farms, you can argue, are fairly small, we see a progressive increase in the size of farm operations as time goes on, in order to achieve a certain economic size. And that means that the actual physical size gets larger and larger and larger, because the margins are so tight. So that leads then to an increase in the land area, and it also often goes hand in hand with an investment in technology, actually, in terms of machinery and the like. I guess the extremes there are the big zero-till operations, where you see in Australia farms getting up to 10,000 hectares, Latin America as well, with these huge machines, basically, for very precise placement of seed and fertilizer. And of course, the other side of the coin is some of the farms we work on in countries like Rwanda or Malawi, where basically one of those machines wouldn't fit on the farm. Because basically the farm's not big enough for it to drive through the gate. Yeah.
Well, so so resources on the farm are a factor. To what extent do you think the research, the knowledge base, the evidence base for agroecological technologies is adequate to allow farms to consider implementing them. So one argument might be that there's been considerable investment in, what I have called optimizing simplicity, getting, hybrid seed and fertilizer efficiency really optimized for certain large productive environments. And then a similar amount of research also has not been put to use in figuring out how to use other forms of agricultural more ecological crop technology. Do you think that inequity in investment's been a factor?
Well, that's actually one of the arguments that often is brought up around the whole issue of agroecology. If we'd spent as much money on research for agroecology as we have for conventional agriculture, we'd be much further down the line. And again, I wonder whether that's really an argument that holds so much water, because if I look at my own research, if you like, all the way through, and I was trained actually as a plant ecologist, and then I came into agriculture after a PhD on conservation of orchids. Yes, I made that transition in many ways. But I've always tried to use the principles of ecology in the research we've done. So looking at legumes, biological nitrogen fixation has got to be one of the most fantastic resources for agroecology and ecological approaches in agriculture. When you looked at the ways of trying to maintain soil fertility in different environments on smallholder farms, and think back to all the work we were doing in the 80s and 90s through the Tropical Soil Biology and Fertility Program around green manures and agroforestry trees and all these different approaches. What we found is, even in places where we've had massive demonstration extension programs with green manures and legume fallows, that when those projects have moved on, that the technologies have evaporated, and evaporated to the level that you can hardly find them at all. So I was in southern Malawi 2 weeks back, and those are areas where we know that potentially, with green manures, we could work on agroforestry, we could improve profitability or soil productivity, let's say. And yet farmers don't take them on. And the question is why? Well, and it's usually because they're very demanding of labor or land, so that you have to invest so much to get the green manures to grow, either a season or the management within a crop. And the smallholder farmers, although they've only got a small area of land, they're very often strapped for time to do other things. So it actually means that the low input technologies that we see could be used to maintain soil fertility under those conditions are often rejected by farmers. And interestingly, in history, the biggest usage that we can find in history of green manuring is actually on large commercial farms and not on smallholder farms. And sometimes I rack my brains about why is this, and why can't we make it work?
So Ken, to what extent have those efforts been in fully engaging the people whom they're intended to benefit? Because I would say that when the McKnight program that I work with has funded people who are also trying to increase fertilizer use, the same thing has happened. The minute the fertilizer project, for example, in finger millet, the researchers showed clearly that putting fertilizer on finger millet really improved finger millet productivity, which seems like a no-brainer, and yet it wasn't something that was practiced. Finger millet was considered to be a crop that you don't fertilize, so it was new to people that there was such a strong response. Yet when the program stopped providing people fertilizer to demonstrate this, people stopped fertilizing their finger millet. So I think the overall observation from decades of practice in that sort of context is that if you don't engage people to find out what works and doesn't work for them, there's a whole gamut of reasons why people are unable or unwilling or uninterested in doing what you suggested that they do. So fertilizer and hybrid maize seed can work fantastically well to improve productivity. But I read a paper yesterday from South Africa in which a massive program to implement hybrid maize seed and fertilizer did not work at all, and they dug in this paper into the reasons why. And one reason was that the particular hybrid maize variety in question happened to be very vulnerable to post-harvest problems. And that's actually their number one issue. Yield didn't even make their short list of priorities. So the fact that it was higher yielding wasn't really that big a deal. Stuff went bad in store, which, between you and me is probably extremely, in addition to being nasty, is also highly toxic in many cases. And another case where in Sawmill, they bred sorghum that, is awesome. But when people pounded it, the thinner pericarp didn't pound off as easily. So you got these nasty things that stick in your teeth. So, people don't use it, improved sorghum variety, if it's something nasty is in your teeth.
I think we both have sufficient experiences of those types of things where we're sure. I mean, working in a participatory mode can actually advance you much more quickly down the line in terms of appropriateness of technology and the like. I mean, on the green manure side, we pulled back very much through the experience that we had, testing these out with farmers, but instead of just saying which of the green manures do you want, lining them up alongside other technologies like grain legumes. And everybody was going for, we want beans or soybean or pigeon pea or something that gives us a product now and the benefit of soil fertility, not just either or. And I think that those approaches can work very well indeed. My own feeling about the whole issue with fertilizer in Africa is that, it's the one continent on the planet where basically farmers have to pay the full and more than the full economic price of fertilizer, which isn't true, I think, in virtually any other continent, maybe apart from Australia. Where basically structural adjustment has led us to a situation where the removal of all subsidies have made actually fertilizer use so uneconomic that farmers have shunned it. And we see movements now in terms of a readjustment of some of those policies to actually allow for a more favorable product to price ratio for inputs.
And the legume people make the comment that if you don't fertilize your legumes, you won't get the, even the soil benefits that are anticipated.
Definitely.
There's no phosphorus in the soil that your legume cannot perform for you.
They can't make phosphorus and potassium, so that in a sense it is a no-brainer that we do need nutrients to be brought in some ways.
But that's, I think, where you and I agree on this sort of not extreme doctrinaire position with regard to, fertilizer. What does that mean?
So it's using the available resources in the most efficient way, and relying, I think, on biology as much as we can, which for me would also include using GM, genetically engineered approaches where appropriate, and those for me would generally be in those cases where you can't get a disease resistance in without crossing genetic barriers. So the brown streak in cassava, the Xanthomonas wilt in banana, Phytophthora in potato, although maybe we disagree on that a bit. I don't know.
Conceivably, mycotoxin resistance in maize, which is my personal obsession. It's breeding conventional resistance. It's funny, there are a range of points to be made on that one. You can breed extreme susceptibility, which I'm afraid to say has been the norm. The ways that we have increased yield, for example, and to benefit the Midwestern USA, happen to build in extreme vulnerability to these fungi that bring in toxic compounds into the food system. So, that breeding for yield in the American way has been, I think, a public health crisis has brought a public health crisis to Africa. Then, generally breeding for, real mycotoxin resistance has been very challenging. There's preliminary evidence that a transgenic method could work. Personally, I feel there's a lot more evidence that needs to be brought out on that for it to be a credible option. But I hate the idea that now all the money is going to go to transgenic maize for mycotoxin resistance when there are a gamut again of things that you can do to reduce mycotoxins in the African food system, and that would be low on my list as a priority, even though I think it's worth advancing the idea. But, so.
But I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the point you were making before about the storability of maize, we know, I mean, that actually reminds me very much of what went on in Malawi in the 20 odd years ago, when the breeders were coming in with hybrid varieties which were dent varieties rather than flint varieties, and you needed the high starch flint varieties both for storage and for pounding, for making maize meal, and it was basically another example really of not consulting the user well enough early on in the breeding phase in terms of varietal selection.
But fast forward a few years, Ken, there are plenty of dent varieties out in Africa, and I have abundant evidence that says that they are more susceptible to mycotoxin. You know, the fungi can colonize that fluffy dent endosperm more easily than that tough, you know, glassy flint endosperm. So not only, I mean, but the same is true for insects, but it's also for these fungi that are killing people. So again, somewhat to Lotte and Renska's question, I share that question. How can some of these barriers be overcome? To what extent would knowledge that, you know, one avenue is, you know, gives you a highly toxic food system, could that motivate policy that would lead towards more investment in safer food systems? Because it happens that almost everything you do to make a healthier maize crop makes it less toxic. It's not so much a question of trade-offs. It's a win-win situation that if you can raise a healthier maize crop in terms of its water and nutrient status, it's less toxic. If you add fertilizer to a maize crop and you have enough water to carry that fertilizer forward to a good yield, that makes for a much less toxic crop. You know, does that influence people's thinking or not? I don't know. I find these things hard to predict.
I think what you're hinting at, or where it leads me to respond, is very much this idea that when we're always thinking, as scientists, I think very much, that we tend to look for, you know, the one-shot solution. You know, so now it's going to be mycotoxins. So yeah, we have to breed for mycotoxins, without really taking a holistic view. And I think if we do then sit down with a group of people who can think in a more systematic way, you know, using systems thinking, you'd come up immediately in an analysis into the idea, well, hold on a minute, you know, just to go down that route on its own is going to actually lead us into these other problems. And I think it really does raise the need for much more open debates, but also the engagement then very much with policy in order to be able to link to some of these questions, so that, you know, policymakers there are actually maybe demanding around a set of priorities rather than allowing researchers to push for these one-shot solutions, because I think that's very often where it's coming from. Yeah.
But I think we have to consider the issue of holistic answers, but what are the entry points that compel policymakers to even care about agriculture? You know, how can you bring them to the table and then, you know, have what comes off the table be a holistic, you know, sensible look at the thing? But I'm not sure that a holistic invitation really, you know, it compels policymakers. Probably a single tight focused crisis is more effective in that. I mean, what's your thinking on what starts the policy conversation?
Oh, sure. Well, although I think using a food systems approach where you really try and take into account, and not necessarily, you know, a food systems approach really starts, I guess, with the consumer and works backwards rather than starting with the production on the far side. And I think then a food systems approach, which really tries then to say, right, we need to look at the whole food system straight away rather than looking at the different components. I think that can really help. But I do think sometimes crisis galvanizes action. And take the example of this in Africa at the moment. What's unfolding currently across many countries is the damage of the fall armyworm, which is obviously come into, is throughout West Africa. We just saw yesterday some alarming newspaper reports from Kenya. We've seen reports from South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, you name it. It's throughout Africa already. And in some places, people claiming it's causing 60% crop damage, 60% straight away. Now, one of the arguments there in talking to some of colleagues, maize agronomists, Tony Vines here from Purdue at the moment, he's saying one of the best ways of controlling it is BT maize. Now maybe actually this will be a trigger which says to countries, well, actually we're going to use BT maize work, so that the allowance of the first GM products into those countries might well be because of a crisis being caused like this. And then you have a systemic insecticide basically through BT maize.
But yeah, that could also, but if that were practiced, I mean, that came into that South Africa narrative that I mentioned earlier. BT maize is not BT maize is not BT maize, right? You have adapted maize into which you can put BT, but if you just put on some random BT maize, you're going to have a terrible maize crop for a large number of other reasons that it's not adapted. So I think that, you know, hopefully a whole the whole picture, again, a holistic view will be taken. One of the things that's popped up on the chat window here is the issue of the cost of agriculture in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change. Do you see, Ken, a way forward for agriculture that at once addresses productivity concerns, you know, increases productivity, increases all the other good things that we're looking for in terms of livelihoods, sustainability, but is a lower carbon emissions agriculture?
Yeah, well, I spent the whole afternoon yesterday with a group of about 20 mid-career professionals discussing climate smart. Yeah, so the whole idea of climate smart agriculture, to intensify, to adapt to climate variability, and to mitigate at the same time, so to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And yeah, I mean, the best examples that we have there really are examples which which include agroforestry, basically diversification, where we can look at locking up carbon in trees and in biomass to some extent. And I think the other issue, particularly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, is for me is particularly around the whole issue of you know, whether more intense production on small areas of land is actually overall better in terms of the greenhouse gas balance than lower output systems, which basically potentially take more land to produce the same amount of food. And I guess, yeah, this comes back to this whole point really, that I think the answer to those questions will be different in different parts of the world. That, you know, just say we have to do it like this or that is probably not going to address the question. But we do need to really think beyond just say the emissions from one part of the system in terms of land use conversion or just fertilizer use or, you know, methane production from cows when we're addressing questions like this.
But to what extent do you think increasing soil carbon through cover cropping and similar, to what extent does that have a significant role to play in the carbon dynamics of the planet? You know, could significant amounts of carbon be trapped in soil to improve farm productivity?
I think you can improve soil organic matter to improve soil productivity. Whether I don't believe that that's got a particularly strong role to play in carbon sequestration, because I think the amounts that you can trap there are too limited. But I mean, that goes against the grain a bit in terms of the big push for the 4 per mille, yeah, the 4 parts per million or whatever that's being pushed by the French, particularly as a policy directive to actually argue that agriculture has to achieve that in terms of trapping carbon in soil. But as you know, somebody who's looked at a lot of soils in the past, I think that's probably not going to be achieved.
Has anybody done the math on global potential for that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you find different views there again. The guys at Rothamsted did a pullback paper a couple of years ago, which was really saying, come on, guys, let's be a bit more modest about what the likely goals are going to be in terms of carbon sequestration in soils. But then you've got other people on the other hand saying, no, you know, this is really where it's at. And I mean, my own reading is that trapping carbon above ground in terms of trees is one of the few ways really sequestering carbon in agriculture.
I guess trees do both. They sequester it both above and below ground.
Sure.
And semi-perennial crops can do the same. I think we've got like 2 minutes left, Ken, and yeah. We're being asked if we think there's a future for low-input family farming as the main food supply in Africa.
You want to answer this one?
Yeah, I guess I would put the question in the dichotomous thinking category. I mean, it is an incredibly important component of the food supply in Africa, and I think, you know, it can be in the future. Should any one thing be the thing? I guess I'm not inclined to annihilate all smallholder farmers for the sake of large efficient farms. And you have pointed out that small farms can be very efficient in many ecological ways.
So, I mean, my take on this would be that if it's low input and it's a very small farm, then it's basically likely to be a farm which is food insufficient. That if you have too limited an area, then low input is going to give you low output, and that's probably not going to feed the family. So I think that there is an issue of scale here and maybe it sounds a bit obtuse and upside down, that if you want to go low input, you probably need enough area to be able to have the sort of rotations and things you need to be able to produce enough. So I think that there's a bit of...
Yeah, Australians essentially are in that category, right? They run enormous farms because they have a fairly low productivity system.
Yeah. So on that issue, I'm being advised here, we have to remember that I'm going to have a discussion with Will Masters from Tufts University on April the 28th. That will be specifically about the future of smallholder farming. And we'll look there particularly at what goes on in Africa, but also in Asia, where often you have much higher input systems. So I think that will be a very useful contrast. And otherwise, I think it's probably heading towards the end of our hour. So I think, with apologies to everybody for starting half an hour late and promising that we'll make sure that technology works next time. Hey,
yeah, I'm really sorry. It was such a headache this time. So yeah, I would like to definitely submit my apologies to anyone who's inconvenienced by that, and thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, and Rebecca, I mean, I look forward to finding a time when we can really sit down with a cup of coffee, beer maybe, and dig into some of these issues again together. Because I think that...
Likewise, please accept my verbal fan mail, Ken. I really enjoyed following I really enjoyed your latest chapter in the forthcoming book, and recommend that to one and all.
It was okay. Cheerio, everybody.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.